It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, my dear colleague, Jasmine Greenaway from Microsoft. Hello, Jasmine, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Welcome, and the stage is yours. Please rock on.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but welcome everybody. My name is Jasmine Greenaway, and I am a cloud advocate at Microsoft. I'm coming to you from all the way from New York City from my desk in Brooklyn. So I'm gonna get a timer started here to make sure that I don't go over time because there is a lot of information in here that I want to share with you today. So, my background before I got into developer relations and why I wanted to come to speak today is that I used to be a .NET developer myself before, as a software engineer, before I came on to developer relations at Microsoft. I honestly adopted Azure when I joined Microsoft because I didn't, we, the teams that I were on prior didn't really use the cloud until I joined Microsoft 3 years ago. So we're going to walk through a few Azure services, but before we do that, I kind of want to frame this conversation a little bit more with some data. So this presentation is based on a blog post that I did about the top 5 Azure services that .NET developers should check out if they're interested in adopting Azure and using the cloud. So today we're going to talk about the .NET developer ecosystem, what it is today, and to kind of back up the data and the information that I have for these 5 services that I want to walk through today. And then we'll talk about why would you want to use Azure and .NET, and then we'll get into those 5 services and we'll end with a demo. Now, when I did that blog post, I kind of went from my experience as a .NET developer. So, it was really off the top of my head. But for this presentation, I wanted to look at some data from everywhere to kind of see what the ecosystem is based on, the community. So the first thing I want to look at is the overview of the Stack Overflow 2020 results. So what we're looking at is the results of the technology stacks or the correlated technology stacks in this graph. So here we are in this red circle, and we can see that we have quite a number of different technologies that your average .NET developer will use. So some highlights here. We have it's more likely that somebody who is building with Windows or building a .NET application is going to be building for Windows or on the Windows machine. We also have adoption of Azure, and we also see that a lot of .NET developers seem to gravitate between to Microsoft SQL Server. Another thing, and outside this red circle, we can see that a lot of these other technologies are web-based. So Angular.js, we see a lot of .NET devs using Angular in the front end, React, Vue, all these other front end languages, also TypeScript as well, and also a splash of Node and MongoDB and things like that. Also jQuery. So our ecosystem is pretty expansive, but we tend to gravitate toward these stacks here, these technologies in the stacks here. So moving along, I thought it was also interesting to check out JetBrains developer survey as well. And one of the interesting things that I really liked about this survey is that they drilled down into specific language-based technologies. So this first one we're looking at here is the adoption of what editors do C# developers like to use. So we can see the highest here is Visual Studio. And keep in mind, this is just from people who have visited the site and taken the survey. So that is not reflective of the entire community, but is reflective of the sample, or not even the sample set, but the set of survey takers. So we see a large number of them have used Visual Studio, and I thought that was interesting when correlated with this diagnostic tool for Visual Studio Visual Studio's built-in performance tool. And it made me kind of think that maybe these two things here might be correlated with each other. So continuing on, we also see that .NET developers, specifically C# developers, adopt new versions quickly, and and C#7 is kind of a little bit behind this 52%, 48%, 50%, not too far apart, but we're seeing that the majority is going to those newer things. So it'll be interesting to see when the 2021 survey comes out to see what the adoption of C#9 has been. So continuing on, at the bottom here, we are seeing what runtimes you regularly use. Also, again, we're seeing .NET Core and Framework kind of close to each other. And I think, as the adoption of .NET Core is continuing to grow, I think that a lot of developers are probably in a situation where they're seeing the framework, maybe at work or the organization, they're seeing the framework has benefits as well as .NET Core. So maybe in their technical ecosystem or their technical outline, they're finding that sometimes they're using framework and sometimes they're using core for certain things, which is absolutely fine. But we're seeing that adoption of core growing. So now I want to show you a little bit more metrics and numbers from Microsoft as well. So we have over 2 million .NET Core, .NET 5 devs. The open source community is pretty expansive, very active. Number one most loved framework and that Stack Overflow survey that we were looking at earlier of .NET Core. So again, adoption of .NET Core is growing. Top 5 language on C# is on GitHub is C#. We have great performance. And then another really interesting point that I saw here is that the newcomers to .NET, 40% are students, which is really exciting to see this next generation of .NET developers. So continuing on with that adoption, we have over 5 million active users or adopters of .NET, and we saw over 700,000 new monthly active .NET Core developers in the last year, which is really exciting. And also, being able to, and I bet this correlates with, this ability to be able to create and deploy from anywhere. So it's not just Windows. You can do this on Linux, on Mac. So, as those tools and support for those tools and these different platforms grow, I'm sure we will see these numbers continue to increase. Now, what does this all mean? So for .NET developers, I would say this is what, and these are my assumptions that I've drawn from this data. .NET developers are open to trying new things. We saw the adoption of C#8 is growing, and it'll be interesting to see what the survey results will say for 9. .NET developers love their tools. We saw that the correlation of Visual Studio with that diagnostic tooling. So we seem to go to the tools that we know and love. I mean, personally myself, I am also a big Visual Studio fan. I love to use it, so I can totally understand why a .NET developer, your average .NET developer, would too. Also, as we saw in that graph, we didn't see many NoSQL databases. There definitely were there. I definitely saw MongoDB and things like that. But it seems like we seem to adopt any relational databases more, and specifically SQL Server. In my experience as a .NET dev, I exclusively work with SQL Server, so I can see how this could be true. And next, finally, we saw that we're using new features of C#. We're using new tools. We're using new things that are coming out with .NET, specifically even with .NET Core. And with this new generation of developers, where 40% of adopters of .NET Core students, I can only see that this adoption is going to continue to grow. So, with all that said, let's shift gears here to the cloud, and specifically Azure. So, don't tell anybody, but Azure was, initially built with .NET developers in mind. So, secret between you and me who are watching out there. And, with that comes a really great set of features that is equipped or equips a .NET developer to do their best work and do it efficiently and quickly and with the tools they love. So we have, extensive APIs that, support, so you can support your services, your Azure resources without without having to do it all in the portal, or you can do it programmatically. Also, tooling and integrations within Visual Studio, VS Code, and command line, so you can manage your Azure and manage your Azure resources, and also work with your Azure resources without having to go to the portal or a browser every time. Also, compatibility for .NET Framework, .NET Core. So it doesn't matter which runtime you're on, there's support for it. And then also support for application and databases of varying versions. So if you are considering, making a migration, there's most likely support for you as a .NET dev. Also, also support for hybrid situations. So if you have some things where it needs to be on premise or on your own servers, and but you also want to adopt things in Azure as well as part of your entire workload, that is an option for you as well, and there's support there for you. So continuing on, we're going to get into those 5 Azure services. And to keep in mind, as I mentioned before, this is based off a blog post, and I actually kept the 5 services that I mentioned in that blog post because all of these services actually ended up kind of correlating with that data that we saw earlier. So let's get into it. And the first one I really want to touch on is the Azure Storage Account, because it's really the Azure service that you're going to see very often. I would be very surprised if you are working in Azure and you have not seen an Azure Storage Account. And it's a really great service because it's a really wonderful way to manage your data in under one account. So you can have all of these 5 things: blobs, files, queues, tables, disk, in under one Azure Storage account. And you can also add things like security and things like that. And it's just a really nice starting point for interacting with Azure. It's also a great starting point for interacting with Azure from your desktop with the Azure Storage Explorer. So that should say Azure Storage Explorer, not account. So the Azure Storage Explorer is this application that you authenticate and log in with Azure, and you can interact with your files, your storage, your blobs, and things like that, all on your desktop. And the other really interesting thing about the Azure Storage Account is, say that maybe you have an Azure Storage account that you don't want to touch. Maybe it's you have a lot of things going on in it, and that's for reduction, or that's for a specific purpose, but you want to evaluate or maybe try out some other types of features within the storage account. You can actually I believe it's only on Windows, but the Azure Storage Account Storage Explorer comes built with an emulator, and what that allows you to do is create blob storage, and I believe file shares locally on your machine with the emulator without having to create the service in the Azure Storage Account. So you can evaluate, you can test, you can access these files from your local machine, and have that set up as a emulated version of the storage account without actually having to create a new service. Another tool here is the AZ copy utility. And it's a really great command line tool for copying your Azure, the contents of your Azure storage from one place to other. So whether that's your desktop to Azure storage and vice versa. So here's an example of kind of what you can do with AZ copy. So this specific script here that I put together just gets copies files that have been updated in the past 10 minutes to a blob storage container and will overwrite them if they're newer. So think about if you are doing something like a click once deployment and you want to be able to serve updates to your end users. And maybe you don't want to use a file share. You could use something like you could use a file share, or you could use Azure Blob Storage. So you could set your Azure Blob Storage container as that update location for whenever somebody were to open the application, and you would copy and paste your published files to there. So AZ copy could be a great place for this because when you're publishing a new version of maybe like a WPF application, you have some files that don't get updated at all. And it's nice when you're able to just copy the files that are updated. So you could use AZ copy to kind of build that into your CI/CD process, or whatever deployment process that you have. So moving along, next is Key Vault. So, with things like Key Vault, we can avoid things like, and this is honestly pure anecdotal from my experience. I remember, us putting our passwords in a web config in web forms and things like that, and MVC when that came out, and so. Thankfully, with things like Key Vault, you have a fully managed centralized storage of your critical secrets. And the nice thing about that is you can also version the secrets, so you can see kind of how they've changed over time if you wanted to. So not only can you store passwords and API keys, but you can store certificates and tokens as well. And so you can import what you already have or create new versions of these secrets. Now, you might be wondering how to access these things, because at the end of the day, when you create a service in Key Vault, it gives you a little endpoint or a little URL with the Key Vault name in there. And so say that I had a secret name test, it'd be my Key Vault my Key Vault name Key Vault at Azure, whatever it's called, / test. And that would give me access to my secret if I'm authenticated or if I'm authorized to access that secret called test. And there's a few ways that you can do this. You can do this with a security principle, because Key Vault kind of works with Azure Active Directory in that way, where you can add yourself as a user, you can add a group, or even a service principal, and boil it down to a specific app that has access to that Key Vault. In addition to that, you can also add an access policy, so you can administer to somebody's machine, or an app to be able to authorize that access to that specific Key Vault secret. And then also, like I said before, you can access the secret keys and certificates through the API as well. Next is Azure Functions. So I'm not going to spend too long on this slide, because for those of you who might be familiar with Azure, you all have probably used Azure Functions. It's a really popular piece of the Azure serverless platform, and it's really extensive, and there's a lot of tooling. So you can get started. And the nice thing about it is you can get started locally on your machine before you even deploy to Azure, before you even use it in Azure. So to get started, you could, if you're on VS 2019, you just install the Azure workload and it's already baked in there. If you're in 2017, just download the extension to get started. You can also use it through the command line, and you can also use it through VS Code. And then with these options, you can also deploy to Azure through these tools as well. Another interesting feature here is, with a lot of serverless technology, it there's one piece is that a lot of these functions are stateless. There's no history or no knowledge of what happened at the last time a function was executed. So whether that was triggered by a post request, or if that was triggered by a change in storage. Or a change in storage, you just don't know what happened prior. So with durable functions, you can create these stateful APIs. So definitely check out Azure Functions. If you're ready to just code and get started, I would highly recommend you use one of these avenues to get started locally and check it out. Okay, so moving on to databases. So as we saw in that graph, SQL Server is highly adopted by a large number of .NET devs, and that we have Azure SQL and Azure SQL Managed Instance, which are based on the latest stable versions of the SQL Server database engine, and actually get applied with updates before SQL Server, before those updates come to SQL Server. So in other words, the updates to the engine are applied to Azure SQL first, and then they get applied to SQL Server later. So this is a great way for you to kind of check out what's coming next for SQL Server. If you're using on-premise, you want to spin up an Azure SQL Server instance, see what's going on, and check that out. So again, with Azure SQL, built on the SQL Server database engine, what you're getting is that with Azure SQL, you're getting a fully managed SQL Server platform. So backed up, so automatic backups, failure recovery, and another thing called automatic tuning, which is really great for fine tuning, performance issues, or even things that can be improved upon through automation. So the difference between Azure SQL and Azure SQL Managed Instance is Azure SQL Managed Instance is for those who are maybe have been using SQL Server for a long time on their on-premise server, and they might be concerned about the compatibility between versions of Azure SQL. Like I said, it's a latest stable version of SQL Server, and maybe on their server they don't have the most latest stable version of SQL Server at that time, and they're concerned about what that can do. So with the Azure SQL Managed Instance, you can migrate your data to this and be able to manage and service any backwards compatibility that you might need. I forget. I think it's all the way to I think the oldest version of SQL Server that's still in service mode. I forget the name of it. But the last one that is available to use in SQL Server. So that's how far back it goes, which I think might be 2008. Either way, one thing that another thing with Azure SQL Managed Instance is this idea of the hybrid benefit. And let's go to the next slide. The hybrid benefit, where you can, when you're migrating this data, it's going. One thing that we typically tend to see is that when we make these migrations to the cloud, that it's usually a little cheaper. And with the hybrid benefit, this is for those who want the benefit of SQL, Azure SQL, like all the fully managed things, the backups, the tuning and things like that, but might need but not need that backward compatibility. So check out the higher benefit if you are interested in that. So again, with Azure SQL Managed Instance, you get all the nice things the cloud has to offer, like you would with Azure SQL. So backups, intelligent tuning, all of those things. So now let's move on. Oh, another point here, with that topic of migration, there are many ways for you to lift and shift your database, your applications to Azure. So, and the nice thing about it is that you even have a chance to assess the cost, what will happen, and and SQL Server Managed Instance is built to provide a seamless transition from on-premise to the cloud, so that your end users don't even know what's going on in the background. So the next thing that I wanted to touch on here, and this is the last one, is application insights. As we saw, we love to track our performance. We love that instrumentation, and we also have that same functionality in the cloud. Now, application insights is a subset of Azure Monitor, and Azure Monitor is where in the cloud we store metrics and logs, performance issues, and then also here through Azure Monitor is where you can set up alerts if something were to happen to your application or your database. So with application insights, you can actually monitor your live applications and the metrics and logs that come with them. And the way that you set up, I like to boil it down to a 3-step process of creating your application insights instance, and then getting that instrumentation key, and then using it in your application, which would involve a process of installing the application insights package in NuGet, and then setting the places where you want to log and check out your metrics. So I would say it's minimal setup. There's also some options for doing this offline, and there's some built-in functionality with Visual Studio as well for this. But a feature that's super, super specific for that and actually exclusive to .NET developers is this snapshot debugger. And what the snapshot debugger allows you to do is check out specific your application at specific points in time. So say that you keep on seeing a exception being thrown, and you set a snapshot on it, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. You can actually either step through that snapshot in Visual Studio in a live version of your production app. So say this app is in production, you need to quickly check out what's going on. Or you can, step through this your snapshot in the portal. So it's kind of like up to you where you want to do that. So they're really, like I said, again, this is a feature that is only specific to .NET devs. So definitely check it out. So now we're going to move on to our demo. So this demo that I have here, it's one, and what I've actually done is built on top of a demo I already have. So let's just go ahead to check it out. So this demo here is actually it's an Azure function. And I actually started building it when I built it a while ago, but I built it by getting started with the Azure Functions workload in Visual Studio. So I believe this is a .NET Core. I think I'm using .NET Core 3. And what this application does is, as it says in the project name, is it converts a CSV file to a JSON file. So for those of you who might be new to Azure Functions, when you create an Azure function, you can it needs a trigger. It needs something to set up to start executing the code. And here I set that up as the blob trigger. And so once I drop a CSV file into blob storage, into my my blob container called to convert here, then it will start this process of converting these CSV files. Now, so that was the initial functionality. And now what I built on top of it is to insert that JSON into a row as a row into Microsoft SQL Server. Now, this is going to take some, so that means I need access to I need to insert, or I need to authenticate. I need my username. I need a password. I need the server name. I need all of those things, and those are all actually saved in Azure Key Vault. So I've stored that information in Azure Key Vault, so I don't have to worry about where it is. In fact, if I look at my local.settings JSON file, which is the configuration file that you would use to set up secrets and all that for your function, it's actually pretty quiet in here. And in fact, what I've done here is I'm using the Azure Storage Explorer as my emulator for my converter. So, and then I guess we'll also, and then I'm also using that storage connection string that I have in my local settings JSON as my location for my blobs. So, yeah, I guess I'll just go ahead and run this, and we'll take a look at what it does. Let's put a few, and actually not even leave, I'm not going to put any breakpoints here, but let's just get started and run it. So the first thing you're going to see is this command line that shows up, kind of showing you the functions that it has identified, and then just some specific status things about the application. So it's opened up my command line, and while this is running, I'm going to open up Storage Explorer. So I have two separate JSON files here running through, and you can see here in testing, I I had some past data, and so in here you can see everything that I kind of did in the past, but I just cleared it up. But on the left here, is the emulator that I'm working with, and here I can have emulated queues and tables and things like that. But here I'm just emulating this blob container called to convert. So here my application is still booting up here. Might take a second, but while that's booting up here, I'm going to go ahead and just get a new, I'm just going to copy over one of these files so that my function can trigger when this file or this information gets. So I'm going to just copy this file, paste it in here, and then it's going to ask me if I overwrite. And notice that you can actually get an AZ copy command. Like I was mentioning before, AZ copy is a way for you to interact with your Azure storage through the command line. And okay, now we're set. So now, and you can see that it's identified my blob trigger, and now it's converting to JSON. It's taking that file, the airport test data that I just dropped into there, and my function is done. And notice that my blob triggered again, because now when it turned my CSV file into a JSON file, it triggered it again and told me that it's not a CSV. Because that file just got created in JSON. And we can actually take a look at what it looks like in here as well. And it might take a second here. And that's really nice. So it'll download and it'll open it up for me. I'm not sure what file it's going to open. Oh, okay, it's open up in VS Code. Great. Might take a second. But while that's opening down into my insert row function here. So after that blob gets created, and I create the blob, I take that JSON and insert it just as a row in SQL into Azure SQL, just for testing purposes, just for demo purposes. So here, notice that I'm using Azure Key Vault here to get the password from Key Vault, and all I have to do is pass in, and in my function here, I pass in the name of my connection that I have stored it as in Key Vault. And here is, how I access all of that through Key Vault. And yeah, and I use that as my SQL connection, and I just insert that data and the time into Azure SQL. So let's see if that JSON file is open. Still taking a second here. Oh, yeah, here we go. So and I actually can open up, if I open up, let me open this up in VS Code. Just let me drop it in here, hopefully. Because I don't want to open this up in another application. I don't want to open this up in VS or Excel, which it will open up in by default. And then there is, yeah, that's CSV file. So yeah, so there's that. So moving on back to inserting this row, let's look at this in Azure SQL. So Azure SQL, here I have some test data that I already tried, and I'm just and you can see that it's already telling me, you can see that this is coming from Azure SQL, and I'm just going to execute this file here in SQL Server Management Studio, and there we go. And now I have my fourth row in here, and it's the same data as before, just a JSON file. By the way, you can actually parse through this JSON data. There is actually built-in SQL commands to Azure SQL and in SQL Server to parse through JSON data. So if you didn't know that, that is information there. Okay. So let's kind of take a look at what this looks like in the Azure portal. So I'm going to open that up if I can find it. Let's see here. We're going to go to the Azure portal here. We're going to look here. Okay. So the first thing here is Key Vault. And in Key Vault, here is where I would store my keys. And you won't be able to see anything in my keys because let me refresh here. Oh, my secrets. Sorry about that. My secrets. And here are where all of my storage connections are saved. Now, the way that I was able to access this was through my through an access policy. I was able to do that through the command line. But like I said before, you can do this through Azure AD as well. It's really up to you. So yeah, so I can also look at past versions of deleted secrets and things like that. So now let's go to another service in here. Let's go check out the oh yes, Azure SQL. And in here, I have just references to the databases that I'm working with. So, and and I also have a SQL pool in here as well. But yeah, that's it. And I can also find my connection and server information here as well. And as you saw, for the most part, I didn't do a lot of work inside the Azure portal. I really just relied on the tools that I had here already within my IDE, within on my desktop. Now, if you were interested in taking, if I were interested in taking this application and uploading it to or deploying it to Azure, you have lots of like I said, you have lots of options here. I could just right click publish, uh, right click on the project and publish, and then from there I could set up my application settings and all of that. In fact, I wouldn't really have to set up any additional application settings other than my location of my storage account um, in when I deploy it to Azure, because my key vault's already set up. So it's really up to me to set up, my storage connection string so that it points to a storage account in Azure. So yeah, that's it really for my demo. Yeah, and this was just to really show you like what you can do, things you can do with Azure on your machine before you send it off to Azure. And yeah, a bunch of, I was able to build, a bunch of things on top of each other right within my machine and utilize Azure in that way. So let's go back to the slides. And I mean, that's really it for this presentation. And if you are interested in learning more, I would recommend that you just go to the short link. This short link has information about the what Microsoft recommends for .NET developers to check out for Azure services. So there's the ones that I touched on in here, but there's a few more that Microsoft recommends that you check out. So thank you so much for joining, and yeah, and I guess we can do some Q&A.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Jasmine, for your session. I really enjoyed this. Luckily, we fixed my sound issues shortly after you started. Really great end-to-end trip on Azure services, which might help to build better projects using .NET. And yeah, we have lots of questions. Let's start from the one about storage. Serhi is asking how much physically and logically isolated one storage from another, and as a follow-up, could the same storage be reused or shared between different accounts, subscriptions, services, Azure services? So how does this work?
Yes. So each different type of each different storage account, or each different types of ways that you can interact with your storage are independent from each other. Now, you can use something like AZ copy, even just like a built-in script, either Bash or PowerShell, to migrate some of these things from one to another. You can also set this up through some serverless technologies if you need to migrate things from one place to another. Yeah, so yes, they are independent. Now the topic of sharing this or other subscriptions and things and users getting access to that, yes, you can go into the I believe it's the identity management or access policies, and either provide an access policy link to a user, or you can add them as with specific roles.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Also, it's a great question slash comment. So you told lots of good words about Azure SQL, but haven't mentioned Azure Cosmos DB. Could you say a few words about this kind of data storage? When to use this? How to use this?
Absolutely. So coming back, I'm going to actually come back to this view here of this graph. As we can see here, we see MongoDB actually has, really great representation here in this graph. And yes, Cosmos DB is a really great cloud provider or a cloud platform for those of you who want to go down that document DB NoSQL route. Yeah, and that's absolutely an option for you. And so the underlying technology is that it's this document based way of storage. In my opinion, it looks a little bit like JSON, so that makes it easier for me to work with. In fact, that JSON file that I had, I could actually upload that to MongoDB. But the main point here is that with .NET, there is support. I believe it's the API is called document I think it's called like document API for .NET, and you can use that to interface with MongoDB. And also you can use it for I was mentioning before, the Azure storage account. Let me go there for real quickly. The Azure storage account for tables, where you have that key value store, you can use it. You can use that same API there too. On top of that, and goes for the same with Azure SQL. If any of you are Entity Framework fans as well, you can also integrate that with your in the cloud as well.
Awesome. Yeah.
Thank you for your question.
I can only add that Cosmos DB is a very flexible kind of storage in terms of different ways you can work with this. So multiple APIs are available. If you wish to have MongoDB like, there is such API. If you wish to have sort of SQL like, there is also such API, plus Graph API, plus Column API. Yeah, and
all of that.
you
Yeah.
will enjoy working with Cosmos DB. And the last question is from Anli. So the best practice is to use Azure Key Vault with Azure DevOps and ARM templates. Isn't it better to just store passwords in variables for different environments, etc.?
Yeah, I think this really comes down to, your development environment, and, what are the pieces of the most vulnerable parts of your stack. Yes, you can use it within, it is recommended to use, well, it's recommended that, you kind of keep your key vault as far away from, the part of, I guess, the opportunity to come to like a attack or something like that. I mean, not like it could really happen if you have, the right permissions. But I don't know, I guess it's really up to you. And I think just like you can integrate with Key Vault through .NET, you can do it with your command line too. So you can store your, these API keys, your keys for publishing and for running, whether it's tests or things like that within Azure DevOps, and automate on that as well too, and put that in as a piece of your CI/CD process. I hope that answered your question, but thank you for it.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Jasmine, for your session and for your answers. Have a great Friday and have a great weekend, and talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. You too.